Revelation chapters 12 and 13. A great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. And then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. His tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that he might devour her child the moment it was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter, and her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the desert to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ. For the accuser of our brothers, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink back from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury, because he knows that his time is short." When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the desert, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time, out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with the torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to make war against the rest of her offspring, those who obey God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And the dragon stood on the shore of the sea. And I saw a beast coming out of the sea. He had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on his horns, and each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was astonished and followed the beast. Men worshipped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast. And they also worshipped the beast and asked, "Who is like the beast? Who can make war against him?" The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and exercise his authority for 42 months. He opened his mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name in his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. He was given power to make war against them, war against the saints, and to conquer them. And he was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all those whose names have not been written in the book of life belonging to the Lamb that was slain from the creation of the world. He who has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to go into captivity he will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword he will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints. Then I saw another beast coming out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. He exercised all the authority of the first beast on his behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. And he performed great and miraculous signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to earth in full view of men. because of the signs he was given power to do on behalf of the first beast, he deceived the inhabitants of the earth. He ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. He was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast so that it could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. He also forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or on his forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. This calls for wisdom. If anyone has insight, let him calculate the number of the beast, for it is man's number. His number is 666. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. They say, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. The devil you know is better than the devil you don't. In Revelation 12 and 13, we get to know the devil. This story has, like any, 3 parts: conflict, climax, and consequence. A story with 3 parts: conflict, climax, and consequence. While the scene in Revelation 12 and 13 is quite imaginative, there are a couple symbols that really leave nothing to the imagination. Perhaps the most obvious is found in Revelation 12, verse 9. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. Who is the dragon? Satan. A second obvious connection to make is this son born of a woman who is on the throne of God. Now, if those 2 facts, born of a woman on the throne of God, don't make it clear enough, we have verse 5, 12 verse 5. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. Who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. This is a quotation from Psalm 2. A clear prophecy of the coming Christ, the Messiah, Jesus. And it's directly applied to Jesus in Revelation 19:5. Herein lies our conflict. There's an issue of authority here. Both the Son and the dragon make an authoritative claim. Both the Son and the dragon make an authoritative claim. Conflict. 12 verse 5, we're told that the Son will rule the nations. But part of the title of the dragon is that he is the one who leads the world astray. So we have conflict over who rules the world. Who is the one who has authority over the nations? The Son makes a claim to have authority over the nations. The dragon makes a claim to have authority over the nations. And so this story, this conflict comes to a head, a climax. But the climax is not where you think it is. The climax of the story is actually already in verse 5. When the Son goes to sit on the throne, he's identified as the victor reigning with authority by nature of him sitting on God's throne, the place of authority and reign. And everything that follows this is consequence. Consequence of the climax of the story. Well, this is true really of the whole book of Revelation, and it's important to how we understand the truth in it. We've been saying that Revelation is about seeing Jesus. And quickly identified at the beginning of this passage is Jesus on the throne, reigning with authority. You see, the climax of the gospel is at the cross. The climax of the story of Scripture is on the cross. That Jesus said, "It is finished," on the cross. With his death and resurrection and ascension, the price is paid, the book is written, the gospel is accomplished, God has grace on those whom he chose. That's the climax of the story. And everything that follows is natural consequence of that chief story, the gospel. Everything that follows is consequence. Now, I say this is important because so often we look for a future climax. Sometimes we think the climax of the story is the second coming, but it's not. The second coming is natural consequence of the victory Christ won when he cried, "It is finished." We find that in this passage too. There's an awful lot left after verse 5. Natural consequence of the gospel. The gospel is not a classic story about the struggle of good versus evil. The gospel is the story of God's grace for his people in redeeming them at the cross by his decree and will. And in this story, the climax is, in a sense, boring. The consequence kind of seems a lot more exciting. The devil is waiting to devour the child, and the child is... It was halfway on. Now it's all the way on. The child is just snatched up to heaven. That's the climax. And in a way, that's boring to our imagination here in chapters 12 and 13. Because Satan is not a worthy opponent of God. This is why the climax is boring. This is not the classic struggle of good versus evil. Satan is not a worthy opponent of God. We do not believe, as the cults have distorted, that Satan is Jesus' brother. We do not believe, as the cults have distorted, that Satan is a god. The conflict between Satan and God is less like two boxers coming from their corners and more like the relationship between Jesus and Judas. They're both human, sure. They interact, yes. But only one of those two is divine, and he's absolutely in control, absolutely all of the time. And just as Judas poses no threat to the mission of Jesus, so Satan poses no threat to the work of God in his world. In the same way, Satan is a created being, and as such, he's not omnipresent. He can't be everywhere all the time, nor is he omniscient. He does not know everything. So as we might expect, the conflict between these two opposing powers is anticlimactic. We find Michael, the archangel, a more legitimate counterpart to Satan, both being angels, and Michael even disposes of him quite easily. And Christ, beginning in verse 10, is worshipped. He's worshipped, as it says in verse 10, because the salvation and power and kingdom of our God and authority of Christ, important, the reign and authority of Christ over and against the limitations of Satan has begun with the climax of the story, with the cross. The reign and authority of Christ begins with his death, resurrection, and ascension. And all this beast stuff comes after, while Christ has authority, after he's established his reign. So what's the point of all of the consequence then? Well, we're told that Satan has been hurled down. Why? It says in that song there, that hymn beginning at verse 10, because of the blood of the Lamb and the testimony that is the gospel of Jesus Christ. Christ had prophesied about his own death. In John chapter 12, 31, Jesus says himself, now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out. But I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself. He said this to show the kind of death he was going to die. At the cross of Christ, Satan is hurled down. A spatial distinction is made. A spatial distinction is made in Jesus' words in John 12 and here in Revelation 12 and 13. A spatial distinction is made to demonstrate the spiritual reality of the victory of Christ, the authority of Christ, and the limitation of Satan and evil. The vision we have here in chapters 12 and 13 is of Satan decreasing and Christ increasing. So John sees this vision where a spatial distinction is made. We find here three things about our adversary. First, we have a bleeding adversary. Satan has been driven out, hurled down. This is restriction, limitation, imminent death. The spatial distinction made here is assurance that death is imminent and that Satan and evil are beholden to a greater power. I like the way that Vernon Eller, who've quoted a couple times, has it. He talks about a chicken with its head cut off. And he says, as any who have had enough farm experience have seen it, the most active period of a chicken's life is the first few moments after it is dead. With the cutting off of its head, the body goes into the most violent spasms of flopping and lurching around, like a chicken with its head cut off, as the old phrase so appropriately puts it. During the end time in which we live, he goes on to say, we see the tantrums and traumas growing ever more wild and reckless. It is not an indication that evil is growing in strength and about to take over. Quite the contrary. It is evidence that the dragon has already been decapitated and can't last much longer. This knowledge, of course, does not change the seriousness of his depredations or the reality of the damage he yet can wreak, but it does enable us to better stand up under them. And so we know that Jesus has dealt the death blow on the cross, and we have a bleeding adversary, lost and losing, but as Ella reminds us, does not change the seriousness. And so we not only have a bleeding adversary, we have a bloodthirsty adversary. Satan is hurled down. This spatial distinction is made, but he's still on earth. And he turns his face first against the woman who had given birth to the son. Well, who is this woman? Well, she's certainly Mary, the mother of our Lord. But this woman represents more than just Mary. She ought to include the whole church of God, the chosen people. A few reasons why. She has 12 stars on her head. We've seen time and time again through the book of Revelation what the number 12 signifies for us, the people of God. So this woman signifies for us not just Mary, but the chosen people of God. She's protected for 1,260 days, the same number of time as the lampstands or the witnesses that we met last week that we said represented the church. Her offspring are described in Revelation 12, verse 17, as those who obey God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Satan turns his attention to these people, to us. And notice how he intends to deceive the church. Not really with war or calamity, so much as deceit. The principal strategy employed here is deceit. He employs two beasts. These are the false Christs and false prophets that Jesus foretold of in the Olivet Discourse. They're going to get sick of hearing about the Olivet Discourse by the time we're done with this. But these are the passages in the New Testament where Jesus talks end times. And Jesus warned that many false Christs and many false prophets would come in his name to deceive. And here's how we see Satan deceive the false Christs and false prophets. The first beast is a false Christ. He has what seems to be a fatal wound that is healed. The second beast, too, tries to deceive. He looks like a lamb, but speaks like a dragon. These are wolves in sheep's clothing. They attempt to appear as Christ, to appear as angels of light, as we know Satan will masquerade as. Satan manifests as something good, something attractive. He sets himself up as something that we might want. This is how he seeks to deceive the people of God. Many have identified that first beast as the Antichrist. The Antichrist is never, the word Antichrist at least, is never used in the book of Revelation. It's only used in John's two epistles, 1 John and 2 John. And what do we know from John about the Antichrist? Well, we know that the Antichrist is not so, doesn't signify one person so much as an anti-Christian spirit. John says, "Who is the liar? It is the man who denies that Jesus is the Christ. Such a man is the Antichrist." Or over in John 4, "But every spirit that does not acknowledge Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist." Or in 2 John 4:7, "Many deceivers who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh have gone out into the world. Any such person is the deceiver and the Antichrist." The first century church, these original hearers of the book of Revelation, perhaps Nero is on the mind. We've said that Domitian is emperor of Rome during the time of the writing. We've also said that while certainly persecution happened under the emperor Domitian, it was not nearly as significant as the persecution that had happened earlier in the year 40 AD and following under Emperor Nero. Nero launched maybe the greatest persecution against the church. Well, Nero is dead and gone, you might think. So how is he an antichrist for these people? There's this interesting mythology that develops around Nero. It's referred to as Nero redivivus, Nero revived. Mythology goes that Nero would rise again, that Nero would come back to life. And three such claims were made over the coming century. The third and final of which during the reign of Domitian. The Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius talk about this third one and said it was so strong that it almost couldn't be put down. The people believed so strongly that Nero had come back to life that they almost could not be convinced otherwise. And so we read of this first dragon, this anti-Christian power in the world, as having a wound that seemed to be fatal, yet that wound was healed. And we wonder, what is the anti-Christian power at work in the first century church? Well, this commitment to the emperor as God, Nero redivivus, Caesar worship. And those of you who have been coming to adult Sunday school, we recognize the real threat this poses, especially in the church in Ephesus and Thyatira and Pergamum, the first three churches. A real threat to the people if they don't say Caesar is Lord. What about Asclepios? Asclepios is a Greek god from Greek mythology. The snake around the rod that you might see lifted up over our hospitals, that's the symbol of the Greek god Asclepios. Asclepios was the god of healing, and in fact, he was such a good healer that he could even bring people back from the dead. So how might the worship of God been an image on the mind of the initial reader? The image of Asclepios, the Greek gods. What about this thing about no buying or selling? The church in Sardis, another addressee of the letter, had guilds. They were blue-collar people, and to join a guild meant to make routine sacrifices to the Greek gods and to say, "Hail Caesar." And the Christian couldn't do that in good conscience. And so to be a Christian meant no buying or selling or trading. And so we see that the way that the Antichrist is described here, the anti-Christian spirit in the world, has real implications for the first reader. Yeah, we see how we are up against the Antichrist in the year 96 AD. What about for us? How is Satan postured as an angel of light? What are the things that entice us to worship other gods? Certainly false religions have deceived many. Heresies that have seeped into the church. Worldly pleasures that capture our attention and even our worship. Or worldly pressures that force us to bow the knee. We're reminded here that Satan and his anti-Christian beast and his anti-Christian power attempts to look like the triune God. Satan and the two beasts form for us an unholy trinity. Their number, it says, is 666. Do you remember when we talked about the numbers 6 and 7? 7 is the number of perfection. 7 is the number you got to get to. 6 is not 7. It's counterfeit. It's false. It falls short. 6 might as well be 0, he said. It offers us nothing. It didn't meet the minimum requirements to get us where we need to go. And so the number of this unholy trinity, 666, demonstrates for us the utter lack of power and authority that our adversary possesses. Utter imperfection, incomplete, and falling short. But as we've been saying, he's not just a bleeding adversary, but a bloodthirsty adversary. And there's this terrifying section in Revelation 13, beginning at verse 7, that this first beast was given power to make war against the saints and to conquer them. And he was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names who have not been written in the book of life belonging to the Lamb. You see what's happening there. First, we're fearful about the amount of authority that this beast has. We see him making war against all the nations, and we begin to wonder, wasn't Jesus in authority over the nations? And we see him deceiving even the saints. And we start to wonder, well, wasn't there a seal placed on the people of God? We look back to the Olivet Discourse. We hear something very, very similar. For false Christs and false prophets, the two beasts will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the saints, even the elect. If that were possible. It's the same literary function used in Revelation 13. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast. He's conquered them all whose names have not been written in the book of life belonging to the Lamb that was slain from the creation of the world. So we're confronted with the lack of authority in the unholy Trinity, and we're reminded of our God. We have a bloodied Savior. His number is not 666, but 777. Complete perfection, complete authority, complete holiness. And our connection to him affords us a number of blessings. Some of the ones mentioned just in these chapters about the woman. She's given wings like an eagle to fly from the evil one. We're reminded that as the people of God, we will soar on wings like eagles. We have the protection of the God of creation, the authoritative God who reigns. She is protected though the waters rise. The devil spews water out of his mouth, and the earth opens and swallows up the waters. We think of the two builders, the wise and foolish builder. That the people of God have a house built on the rock, that though the waters come, the rains come, and the waters rise, the one who builds their house on the rock need not fear, because you will stand up against the tantrums and traumas of the evil one. We see that the woman has names written in the book of life from the creation of the world. And we remember that God is sovereign and in control, and the evil he permits in the world, he has ordained and is in control of. And we see twice that there is a place prepared for her. There is a place prepared for those who love Jesus. There's a place prepared for the people of God. So we remember that our adversary is bleeding out. He is lost and losing. And though he's a bloodthirsty adversary, he's like a crouching lion seeking to devour, as 1 Peter 5 puts it. He will not overcome the people of God. I'll leave you with this from J.I. Packer. Satan should be taken seriously. He should be taken seriously. For malice and cunning make him fearsome, yet not so seriously as to provoke abject terror of him. For he is a beaten enemy. Satan is stronger than we are, but Christ has triumphed over Satan. And Christians will triumph over him too if they resist him with the resources that Christ supplies. We serve the Holy Trinity, 777, who has given us everything we need to stand up against the enemy. Our victory is assured because it was finished on the cross. And though we live in the end times where the consequences of that climax are still working themselves out, though we live in the time where God is patient so as to bring his full number of his people to himself, we remember that nothing will overcome the people of God. Our adversary, though he turns his face against us, has lost. Jesus has won.